The wildfire raged relentlessly, its fiery tendrils consuming everything in their path. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of crackling flames echoed ominously. Charles Montgomery, a successful but solitary millionaire, found himself in a situation he had never envisioned. He had ventured into the countryside for solitude, a brief escape from the pressures of high society. Yet here he was, surrounded by towering flames with no clear way out. Charles had always been known for his unshakable composure, but at this moment, panic clawed at his chest. His sleek black SUV had stalled on a narrow dirt road, and in his attempt to find help, he had ventured deeper into the woods. Now, the flames had encircled him, and his once perfectly tailored suit was drenched with sweat and soot. His phone had no signal, and each breath brought stinging pain from the acrid smoke. He stumbled over the uneven terrain, his vision blurred by both the dense air and his rising fear. Just as despair began to take hold, a sharp bark pierced through the chaos. Charles froze, his heart pounding. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a rustling in the underbrush. Emerging from the smoky haze was a dog, a scruffy, golden-furred stray with piercing, intelligent eyes. The dog didn't hesitate. Barking urgently, it darted toward Charles, circling him and nipping at his sleeve as if trying to lead him. At first, Charles hesitated. What could a stray dog possibly do in such a dire situation? But the dog's persistence was undeniable. When it tugged at his sleeve again, something told Charles to follow. Guided by the dog, Charles stumbled through the smoky woods, the flames closing in on either side. The dog seemed to know exactly where to go, pausing only to check on Charles before continuing forward. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin and the forest floor gave way to an open clearing. As Charles emerged into the safety of the open air, gasping for breath, he turned to the dog, who stood beside him, panting but alert. This unassuming stray had done what no one else could: saved his life. Charles collapsed onto the cool grass of the clearing, his lungs burning with each ragged breath. The dog sat down beside him, its golden coat streaked with soot, but its bright eyes filled with an almost human-like intelligence. Charles couldn't help but stare at the animal. Who was this creature? Where had it come from? And how had it managed to find him in the middle of the inferno? "Good boy," Charles muttered, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He reached out hesitantly, his hand trembling as he gently patted the dog's head. The dog wagged its tail, a sign of reassurance amidst the chaos. For the first time in hours, Charles felt a flicker of hope. As his breathing steadied, he began to take in his surroundings. The clearing was a small patch of safety, bordered by a shallow stream that had likely kept the flames at bay. Beyond the stream, however, the fire roared, its glowing embers lighting up the twilight sky like some apocalyptic painting. Charles knew he couldn't stay here for long. The fire could change direction at any moment. He needed to find help. The dog seemed to sense his thoughts. It stood up, its tail wagging slightly, and barked once before trotting off a few paces. It stopped and looked back, as if urging Charles to follow. "You've got to be kidding me," Charles muttered, pushing himself to his feet. His legs were shaky, and his once polished dress shoes were caked with mud. He had no choice but to trust this strange guide. "All right, lead the way." The dog moved swiftly, but not so fast that Charles couldn't keep up. It seemed to know exactly where it was going, weaving through the thinning trees with an uncanny sense of direction. Charles followed, his mind racing. He wasn't a man accustomed to relying on others, or anything for that matter. His wealth had always been his safety net, his way of staying in control. Yet here he was, placing his life in the paws of a stray dog. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the forest began to open up. The air grew clearer, and Charles could hear the distant hum of engines. Civilization, relief flooded through him as they emerged onto a dirt road. In the dim light, he spotted a small fire truck parked at the edge of the woods, its lights flashing faintly. A group of firefighters stood nearby, scanning the area. "Hey, over here!" Charles shouted, his voice cracking. The firefighters turned, their faces lighting up with surprise. They rushed toward him, their radios crackling with hurried updates. "Sir, are you all right?" one of them asked, supporting Charles as he swayed on his feet. "We've been looking for anyone trapped in the fire zone. How did you get out?" Charles gestured weakly toward the dog, who was now sitting quietly a few feet away, its tail thumping against the ground. That dog. It saved me. Led me out. The firefighter glanced at the dog, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. That's incredible. You're lucky. This fire spread fast. Most people wouldn't have made it out on foot. As the firefighters helped Charles into the truck, the dog lingered at the edge of the road, watching. Charles craned his neck to keep it in view, an odd pang of concern rising in his chest. So wait, he said, struggling to sit up. What about the dog? One of the firefighters turned. Is it yours? No, Charles admitted, feeling a strange mix of guilt and gratitude. But it saved my life. We can't just leave it here. The firefighter nodded. We'll take care of it. Don't worry. Satisfied, Charles allowed himself to relax as the truck began to move. He watched out the window as the dog disappeared into the distance, its silhouette framed by the glow of the still-burning forest. Back at the fire station, Charles was given oxygen and checked over by paramedics. His thoughts, however, were elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the dog, its determination, its courage. Who knew what might have happened if it hadn't appeared? The next morning, after a restless night at a nearby motel, Charles decided to return to the fire station. He asked about the dog, only to learn that it had been taken to the local animal shelter. Without hesitation, he made his way there. The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, its walls adorned with colorful murals of happy animals. Inside, the receptionist greeted Charles with a warm smile. "You must be the man from the fire," she said. "We've heard about the dog that saved you." Charles nodded. "Is it here?" "It is," the receptionist replied. "We've named him Blaze. He's in the back, resting. Would you like to see him?" Charles followed her through a series of kennels until they reached Blaze's pen. The dog lay on a blanket, its head resting on its paws. When it saw Charles, its tail began to wag furiously, and it stood up, pressing its nose against the bars. "Hey, buddy," Charles said softly, crouching down. "You remember me, huh?" Blaze barked once, a joyful sound that brought a rare smile to Charles's face. He turned to the receptionist. "What happens to him now?" "Well, if no one claims him, he'll be put up for adoption," she explained. "But we can hold him for a bit, considering what he's done." Charles hesitated, his mind swirling with possibilities. He had never owned a dog before. His lifestyle didn't exactly allow for it, but as he looked into Blaze's eyes, he felt a connection that he couldn't ignore. "I'll cover his expenses," Charles said finally. "Whatever it takes." The receptionist at the shelter blinked in surprise. "You'll cover his expenses? Are you saying you want to adopt him?" Charles hesitated. The idea of adoption hadn't crossed his mind, yet his life as a high-powered executive was meticulously curated, with no room for spontaneity or, least of all, a pet. But as Blaze's eyes met his through the kennel bars, there was a pull that Charles couldn't ignore. This dog had saved his life, and walking away felt impossible. "Well, I'm not sure about adopting," Charles admitted, clearing his throat, "but I want to make sure he's taken care of, no matter what." The receptionist nodded. "Understood. We can put a note on his file that his expenses are covered, but you're welcome to spend some time with him while he's here." Charles looked at Blaze, who was now wagging his tail so vigorously that his entire back end swayed with it. "Yeah, I'd like that." The receptionist opened the kennel door and Blaze bounded out, his joy uncontainable. He pressed himself against Charles's legs, tail wagging furiously, as if to say, "Thank you for coming back." Charles found himself crouching down, scratching Blaze behind the ears, the corners of his mouth lifting in a rare, genuine smile. "You're a good boy, Blaze," Charles murmured. The dog barked happily in response, licking Charles's hand. For a brief moment, the chaos and stress of Charles's life seemed to fade, replaced by a calm he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, Charles found himself making excuses to visit the shelter. Blaze quickly became the highlight of his otherwise structured and solitary life. Each time Charles walked through the door, Blaze would greet him with the same unbridled enthusiasm, and each visit seemed to chip away at the walls Charles had built around himself. During one of these visits, the shelter manager approached him with a clipboard. "Mr. Whitman, we've noticed how much Blaze has bonded with you. Have you considered giving him a home, permanently?" Charles froze, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I don't know if I can. My schedule is hectic, and I travel often. It wouldn't be fair to him." The manager smiled gently, Blaze seems to think otherwise. Dogs have a way of fitting into our lives, even when we think they won't. That night, Charles couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He sat in his sleek penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights. The silence, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. His thoughts drifted back to Blaze, his loyalty, his courage, and the joy he brought. Charles's life was filled with wealth and success, but it was empty in ways he had never admitted to himself. A week later, Charles made his decision. He walked into the shelter with a determination that surprised even him. The staff greeted him warmly, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "I'd like to adopt Blaze," Charles said, the words feeling both foreign and right. The receptionist beamed. "That's wonderful. Let's get the paperwork started." As Charles filled out the forms, Blaze sat by his side, his tail thumping against the floor. The connection between them was undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, Charles felt like he was making a decision that wasn't about profits or prestige. It was about something real. The adjustment period was interesting, to say the least. Blaze was full of energy, exploring every corner of Charles's pristine apartment with uncontainable curiosity. The dog's playful antics, chewing on expensive shoes, knocking over a glass sculpture, tested Charles's patience, but they also brought a liveliness to the space that had been sorely missing. One evening, as Charles sat on the couch with Blaze curled up beside him, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed in such a short time. He hadn't even wanted to stop at that gas station, but if he hadn't, he would have never met Blaze. The thought sent a chill down his spine. "You saved my life," Charles whispered, running a hand through Blaze's fur. "And now you're changing it." Blaze thumped his tail against the couch in response, as if to say, "That's the plan." One morning, a week after Blaze officially became a part of Charles's life, something extraordinary happened. Charles was sipping his coffee when his doorman buzzed up to his apartment. "Mr. Whitman, there's a vehicle here for you." A Rolls Royce. Charles frowned. He hadn't ordered a car. "Send it up." Minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and a sharply dressed man stepped out. He carried a leather briefcase and looked every bit the part of someone on an important mission. "Mr. Whitman," the man said, extending a hand. "My name is Alan Jameson. I represent the foundation of the late Marcus Sterling." Charles blinked. Marcus Sterling, a name he hadn't heard in years. Sterling had been one of the wealthiest philanthropists in the country, known for his secretive yet impactful charity work. "I'm here to deliver a message from Mr. Sterling," Alan continued. "It's about your dog." Charles's eyebrows shot up. "Blaze?" Alan nodded. "Yes, Mr. Sterling had a particular fondness for animals and often supported shelters anonymously. Blaze was part of a rescue initiative he funded before his passing. Mr. Sterling believed that animals have a unique way of finding the people who need them most, and he believed in rewarding those who showed kindness and courage." Charles felt his pulse quicken. "What are you saying?" Alan opened his briefcase and handed Charles an envelope. Mr. Sterling left instructions that if Blaze ever found a permanent home, his new owner would be given the means to continue making a difference. "You'll find the details inside." Charles carefully opened the envelope handed to him by Alan, his curiosity mounting. Inside, he found a handwritten letter along with several official-looking documents. The letter was written in an elegant script, its tone both personal and profound. "Dear Mr. Whitman, if you are reading this, it means Blaze has found you, and in doing so, fulfilled a part of his purpose. I have long believed that the bond between humans and animals is one of life's most powerful connections. Animals teach us loyalty, compassion, and courage, qualities that often elude even the most accomplished among us. Blaze was part of a special program I created to rescue dogs with extraordinary potential. Each of them has a unique gift. Some, like Blaze, possess unwavering loyalty and courage that can change lives. These animals find their way to those who need them most, though they may not realize it at the time. I have no doubt Blaze has chosen well. To ensure his legacy and yours, I have set aside a fund to support his ongoing care and to empower you to make a greater impact in the lives of others. The accompanying documents outline the resources at your disposal. Use them wisely. Remember, Mr. Whitman, life's greatest wealth is not measured in currency, but in the connections we forge and the lives we touch. Blaze has brought you to this moment for a reason. Trust in him, and trust in yourself. With warm regards, Marcus Sterling. Charles lowered the letter, his mind racing. Blaze had come into his life by sheer chance, or so he had thought, but this letter made it clear that there was a deeper significance to their meeting. He glanced down at Blaze, who sat patiently at his feet, tail wagging as if to say, "See, I told you I was special." "Mr. Whitman," Alan said, drawing his attention back. "The documents outline a trust valued at $5 million. The fund is meant to be used for charitable purposes, focusing on animal welfare and supporting individuals who, like you, have demonstrated exceptional compassion and kindness." Charles blinked. $5 million? I don't even know what to say. Alan smiled. "There's no need to say anything, Mr. Whitman. The Foundation simply asks that you use these resources to continue the work Mr. Sterling started." The revelation left Charles in a whirlwind of emotions. He had built his career on cutthroat decisions and relentless ambition, yet here was an opportunity to do something entirely different, something meaningful. But the question loomed. Could he step into the role Marcus Sterling envisioned for him? That evening, Charles sat in his living room with Blaze at his side, poring over the documents. The scope of the trust fund was staggering, with detailed provisions for how the money could be allocated. It wasn't just about financial support, it was a blueprint for creating change. Blaze rested his head on Charles's lap, sensing his human's unease. Charles absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur, his thoughts racing. He had spent years chasing power and wealth, yet in the short time Blaze had been in his life, everything felt different. The emptiness he had ignored for so long now seemed glaringly obvious. The next day, Charles decided to take the first step. He contacted Alan and asked for a meeting to discuss how the trust could be activated. They met in a sleek conference room, but the atmosphere was anything but corporate. Alan's demeanor was warm and encouraging as he laid out the next steps. "Mr. Whitman, the beauty of this trust is its flexibility," Alan explained. "You can use it to support existing shelters, create new programs, or even develop an initiative that combines animal welfare with community support." Charles nodded, his mind already spinning with ideas. "I want to start by ensuring that Blaze's shelter has everything it needs. New facilities, medical equipment, training programs, the works." Alan smiled. "A noble start. And after that," Charles paused, his gaze shifting to the window. "After that, I think I'd like to create something new. A sanctuary, maybe. A place where dogs like Blaze can find not just safety, but purpose. And maybe people like me can find the same." That evening, Charles returned to the shelter, this time with a sense of purpose. The staff greeted him warmly, and Blaze, as always, bounded up to him with unbridled joy. But this visit was different. Charles gathered the team and shared the news about the trust and his plans to transform the shelter. The room buzzed with excitement and gratitude. One of the volunteers, a young woman named Mia, approached Charles after the meeting. "Mr. Whitman, I've been working here for years, and we've always struggled to make ends meet. What you're doing, it's going to change everything." Charles smiled, and feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. "Blaze changed everything for me. I'm just trying to pay it forward." As Charles left the shelter that night, Blaze trotting happily at his side, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about charity. It was about finding meaning, building connections, and creating something lasting. And Blaze, the dog who had saved his life, was at the heart of it all. In the days that followed, Charles immersed himself in the plans to transform the shelter and establish the sanctuary he envisioned. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Not in the frenetic, hollow way his business successes had once made him feel, but in a deeper, more purposeful way. Blaze was a constant companion through it all, trotting beside him as he visited the shelter, met with contractors, and brainstormed with the staff. One morning, as Charles arrived at the shelter, he was greeted by Mia and several other volunteers. They were beaming with excitement, gesturing toward a small group of newly rescued dogs being checked over by a veterinarian. Blaze ran ahead, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed at the newcomers, his friendly demeanor helping to calm their nerves. "Mr. Whitman, these dogs were found abandoned at a construction site," Mia explained. "They're scared, but they're safe now." Charles crouched down, letting one of the more timid dogs sniff his hand. "They've been through a lot," he said softly. But they're resilient, just like Blaze. Blaze barked as if in agreement, his eyes sparkling with energy. Charles chuckled, rubbing his ears. Looks like you've got some new friends, buddy. Later that afternoon, Charles gathered the shelter staff in the newly renovated conference room. Blueprints for the sanctuary were spread across the table, detailing expansive play areas, training facilities, and cozy housing for the dogs. I want this place to be more than just a shelter, Charles began. I want it to be a haven for these animals, and a place where people can learn from them. Dogs like Blaze have so much to teach us about loyalty, courage, and finding joy in the simplest things. The staff nodded, their enthusiasm palpable. Mia raised her hand. What about the community? Could we involve them somehow? Maybe offer workshops or therapy programs using the dogs? Charles paused, considering her words. That's a fantastic idea. Let's make this a space where humans and animals can heal together. As the plans for the sanctuary gained momentum, Charles found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't faced in years. At night, he would sit in his study with Blaze curled up at his feet, reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this point. He thought about his late wife, Eleanor, and how she had always encouraged him to seek balance and meaning in his life. He realized, with a pang of regret, that he had ignored her wisdom for too long. Blaze seemed to sense his melancholy during these moments, nudging his hand with his nose or placing a paw on his knee. Charles would smile, grateful for the dog's quiet, grounding presence. "So you're something special, you know that," Charles said one evening, scratching Blaze behind the ears. "I don't think I ever believed in fate before, but meeting you, it feels like it was meant to happen." Blaze wagged his tail and leaned into Charles's hand, his warm eyes conveying an understanding beyond words. One day, while reviewing the sanctuary plans with Alan and a team of architects, Charles received a call from a reporter who had heard about his work with the shelter. The story of Blaze saving his life in the forest had begun to spread, and people were eager to learn more. "I'm not comfortable being the center of attention," Charles admitted to Alan after hanging up. "This isn't about me. It's about the dogs." Alan nodded. "I understand, but sharing your story could inspire others. It might encourage more people to support the shelter or adopt a dog of their own." Reluctantly, Charles agreed to the interview. When the day arrived, he met the reporter at the shelter, Blaze by his side. As the camera rolled, Charles spoke candidly about the events that had led him to this point. "Blaze didn't just save my life," he said. "He changed it. He reminded me of what's truly important: kindness, loyalty, and the connections we build with each other. That's what this sanctuary is about." Blaze, as if on cue, placed his paw on Charles's knee, drawing a laugh from the reporter. "He seems to know when you're talking about him," she said, smiling. "Oh, he knows," Charles replied, ruffling Blaze's fur. "He always knows." The interview aired a week later, sparking a wave of interest in the shelter and the sanctuary project. Donations poured in, along with messages of support from people moved by Charles's story. Families arrived at the shelter to adopt dogs, and volunteers signed up in record numbers. Charles was overwhelmed by the response. He stood in the shelter's courtyard one sunny afternoon, watching as Blaze played with a group of children who had come with their parents to adopt a dog. The laughter and joy in the air were infectious, filling Charles with a deep sense of fulfillment. "Looks like you've started something incredible," Mia said, walking up to him. "This place feels us alive." Charles smiled, watching as one of the children hugged Blaze. "Blaze started it," he said. "I'm just following his lead." That evening, as Charles and Blaze returned home, Charles felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The sanctuary was becoming a reality, and with it, a renewed purpose in his life. As he prepared for bed, Blaze settled into his spot at the foot of the bed, his eyes half closed in contentment. "Good night, Blaze," Charles said softly. "Thank you for everything." Blaze's tail thumped against the bed, his way of saying, "You're welcome." As the plans for the sanctuary progressed, Charles began to realize that his newfound purpose came with its share of challenges. One of the most pressing issues was the financial strain of turning the dream into reality. Despite his wealth, the scale of the project was larger than anything he'd ever attempted personally. The sanctuary wasn't just about building a facility. It was about creating a sustainable ecosystem where dogs and people could thrive together. One afternoon, while reviewing the budget with Alan, Charles furrowed his brow. The numbers don't look good, he admitted, rubbing his temples. Even with the donations pouring in, the costs are skyrocketing. Permits, land maintenance, the specialized equipment, it's all adding up faster than we anticipated. Alan nodded, his expression serious. We might need to scale back some of the plans or find alternative funding sources. Have you thought about reaching out to other organizations or investors? Charles leaned back in his chair, considering the suggestion. The idea of involving outside parties made him uneasy. He wanted the sanctuary to remain true to its mission, without interference from profit-driven agendas. I'll think about it, he said finally. But for now, let's focus on what we can achieve with the resources we have. Meanwhile, Blaze was becoming a local celebrity. The media coverage of his heroism and the shelter's transformation had captured hearts across the region. People came to the shelter not just to see the facility, but also to meet the dog who had saved a millionaire's life. Blaze, ever friendly and affectionate, seemed to enjoy the attention, wagging his tail and leaning into the hands that reached out to pet him. Mia noticed the influx of visitors and approached Charles with an idea. What if we held a fundraising event here at the shelter? Something family-friendly, where people can meet the dogs and learn more about the sanctuary project. Charles nodded slowly. That's a great idea. We could organize an adoption drive alongside it, give these dogs a chance to find their forever homes. Excitement spread among the staff as they began planning the event, which they dubbed the Blaze Benefit. It would feature activities like dog agility demonstrations, storytelling sessions about rescued animals, and a chance for attendees to tour the shelter's new facilities. As the event approached, Charles found himself spending more time at the shelter, ensuring every detail was perfect. Blaze was his constant companion, following him from one end of the property to the other. Despite the busyness of the preparations, Charles couldn't ignore the subtle tension brewing among the staff. Not everyone was comfortable with the increasing attention on Blaze and the shelter. Do you think we're losing sight of why we're doing this? One of the volunteers asked Mia quietly, unaware that Charles was within earshot. It's starting to feel more like a publicity stunt than a mission to help the dogs, Mia sighed. I get what you're saying, but I think Mr. Whitman's heart is in the right place. He's putting everything he has into this project. Charles didn't confront them but carried their words with him. That night, as he sat on his porch with Blaze by his side, he reflected on the direction the sanctuary was taking. Was he inadvertently making it about himself rather than the dogs? The thought unsettled him. Blaze, he said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. Am I doing this for the right reasons? Or have I gotten lost along the way? Blaze looked up at him, his eyes calm and steady, as if to say, trust your instincts. The day of the Blaze Benefit arrived, and the shelter buzzed with activity. Families, local businesses, and even a few prominent figures from the community gathered to support the cause. Blaze was the star of the show, leading the parade of adoptable dogs with his tail held high. Charles watched from the sidelines, a mix of pride and nerves swirling in his chest. As he mingled with the crowd, Charles overheard snippets of conversations that reaffirmed his purpose. I've never seen a shelter like this before, one woman said. They're so clear that the animals are cared for, not just housed. I think I'll adopt today, another visitor added. Seeing how happy these dogs are has convinced me. By the end of the day, the shelter had raised enough funds to cover several months of operations, and 10 dogs had found new homes. Charles felt a surge of relief and gratitude as he stood with Mia and the rest of the staff. This wouldn't have been possible without all of you, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Thank you for believing in this vision, Mia smiled. It wouldn't have been possible without Blaze. He's the real hero here, Blaze barked, as if in agreement, drawing laughter from the crowd. But as the excitement of the event faded, new challenges arose. Charles received a call from the city council, informing him that a group of residents had raised concerns about the sanctuary's impact on the local environment. They claimed the construction and increased activity could disrupt wildlife and water sources in the area. Frustrated but determined, Charles scheduled a meeting with the council to address the concerns. He spent hours poring over environmental reports, ensuring the sanctuary adhered to all regulations. With Blaze at his side, he prepared to defend the project, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever. Whatever it takes, Charles muttered under his breath, stroking Blaze's head. So we're not giving up. The city council meeting was a critical moment for Charles and the sanctuary's future. As he walked into the council chamber, Accompanied by Mia and a few volunteers, the room was abuzz with tension. Blaze waited in the car, but his absence didn't diminish the symbolic weight he carried for the project. Charles set his briefcase on the table and glanced around at the opposing group of residents. They looked serious, arms crossed, ready to challenge every point he made. Across the room, a council member cleared her throat, calling the meeting to order. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her tone neutral but firm, "we've received multiple concerns regarding your sanctuary project, particularly its impact on the local environment and community. Today, we'll hear both sides before making a recommendation." Charles nodded, standing to address the room. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today. The sanctuary is more than just a facility for dogs. It's a place of hope and healing for the animals and the people in our community." He presented detailed reports from environmental specialists, showing that the construction adhered to all regulations and posed no significant threat to local wildlife or water sources. He shared plans for eco-friendly expansions, including solar panels and a sustainable water system. One of the residents stood, her voice sharp with frustration. "We're not against helping animals, but what about us? Increased traffic, noise, and construction, all of it disrupts our lives. It's not fair to prioritize dogs over people." Charles felt a pang of guilt. He stepped closer, softening his tone. "I understand your concerns, and I want to assure you this isn't about choosing animals over people. In fact, the sanctuary is meant to benefit both. We're working on solutions to minimize disruption, quiet construction hours, traffic management plans, and community engagement initiatives." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. As the meeting continued, Mia stepped forward to share her story. "I've been working in shelters for years, and I've never seen a project with this much potential to change lives. Blaze, the dog who saved Charles, is proof of that. He came from nothing, yet his bravery has inspired so many people. This sanctuary isn't just about housing dogs. It's about creating opportunities for connection, compassion, and growth." Her words struck a chord with some attendees. A man in the back of the room stood. "I wasn't sure about this at first," he admitted, "but my daughter adopted a dog from their shelter last week, and it's already changed our family for the better. I think this project could be good for everyone." The debate continued, both sides presenting arguments and counter-arguments. By the end, the council members exchanged glances, deliberating quietly before the head councilwoman spoke. "We appreciate the passion and dedication on both sides. For now, we'll allow the sanctuary project to continue, provided Mr. Whitman adheres to stricter environmental guidelines and community feedback measures." A wave of relief washed over Charles, but he knew the victory was only temporary. He had to prove the sanctuary's worth through action, not just promises. Returning to the shelter that evening, Charles found Blaze waiting for him by the gate. The dog wagged his tail and trotted over, sensing the weariness in Charles's posture. "Hey, boy," Charles murmured, kneeling to rub Blaze's ears. "So we've got our work cut out for us." Mia approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and encouragement. "You handled that well today. I think we might have swayed a few hearts." Charles nodded, glancing at the sanctuary grounds. "It's not enough to win them over in a meeting. We need to show them what this place can truly be." Over the next few weeks, Charles threw himself into improving the sanctuary's operations and reputation. He held open houses, inviting the community to see the progress firsthand. Families who had adopted dogs shared stories of how their lives had changed, building goodwill among skeptical residents. One such story came from a woman named Evelyn, who had recently adopted an older Labrador retriever named Daisy. "I've never felt so loved," she told the group gathered for an open house. "Daisy's not just a pet, she's family. I owe this sanctuary for bringing her into my life." Despite the positive feedback, challenges persisted. A break-in at the construction site one night set the project back by weeks, fueling doubts among the community and even some staff members. Charles spent the following days investigating and repairing the damage, his resolve hardening. "This isn't just about the sanctuary anymore," he told Mia late one evening. "It's about proving that something good can come from all of this, no matter how many obstacles we face." Blaze stayed by his side throughout it all, his presence a grounding force in moments of doubt. One night, as Charles sat reviewing plans for a community garden that would involve local schools, Blaze rested his head on Charles's lap. The gesture reminded him why he started this journey in the first place. "You're right, boy," Charles murmured, stroking Blaze's fur. "This is worth fighting for." The turning point came when a local news outlet covered the story of the sanctuary. The segment highlighted Blaze's rescue, the transformations within the shelter, and the community impact. It painted a picture of hope and resilience, resonating deeply with viewers. Donations poured in, along with messages of support from across the country. Volunteers doubled, and even some of the original critics reached out to offer help. Charles realized that the sanctuary wasn't just surviving, it was becoming a movement. Despite the growing support for the sanctuary, the road ahead was far from smooth. While donations and volunteers flooded in, tensions lingered in the local community. A group of vocal critics had begun rallying opposition, spreading rumors that the sanctuary was overstepping its boundaries and causing disruptions. One morning, Charles arrived at the sanctuary to find a large protest forming at the entrance. A cluster of residents held signs with messages like "Protect our peace and no more noise pollution." The sight made his stomach sink. Blaze, ever watchful, let out a low growl as Charles stepped out of his truck. "Stay here, boy," Charles said softly, though his hand lingered on the dog's head for a moment longer than usual. Mia hurried out to meet him, worry etched on her face. "They've been here since dawn," she said. "It's getting heated. Some volunteers are afraid to come in." Charles squared his shoulders. "Let me handle it." He approached the crowd, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I hear your concerns, and I want to address them directly. Let's have a conversation." A middle-aged man stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You've already ignored us. We've lived here for decades, and now we have trucks coming through at all hours, barking dogs and strangers walking around like they own the place." Charles held his ground. "I understand your frustration, but the sanctuary is working hard to minimize disruptions. We've reduced construction hours and added soundproofing to the kennel areas. I'm willing to hear any other suggestions you have." The man's expression softened slightly, but others in the crowd shouted over him, "It's not enough. You're ruining our neighborhood." Before Charles could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, but what's really ruining this neighborhood is the lack of compassion." Evelyn, the woman who had adopted Daisy, stepped forward from the sidelines. She carried a sign that read, "Support the sanctuary," and looked every bit as determined as Charles had ever seen her. "These dogs aren't just animals," she continued. "They're saving lives. Daisy gave me a reason to keep going after I lost my husband. This sanctuary gave her that chance, and me too." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several protesters looked uncomfortable, their expressions shifting as Evelyn's words sunk in. But just as the tension seemed to ease, a loud screech of tires drew everyone's attention. A black car skidded to a stop nearby, and a man in a suit stepped out, his expression hard and unreadable. He strode toward Charles, holding a piece of paper. "I'm from the Zoning Commission," he announced. "We've received complaints that your sanctuary is in violation of local land use codes. If these claims are substantiated, you could be forced to shut down." Charles felt his chest tighten. "That's not true," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We've complied with every regulation." The man raised an eyebrow. "That remains to be seen. I'm here to inspect the premises. Now." The protesters looked on with a mix of triumph and curiosity as the man marched past Charles toward the main building. Mia hurried to his side. "What do we do?" she whispered. "Cooperate," Charles replied, though his jaw was clenched. "We have nothing to hide." Inside, the inspector scrutinized every detail, from the kennels to the storage areas. Blaze followed close behind, his presence a quiet reassurance. The inspector took notes on a clipboard, his face giving nothing away. Finally, he paused in front of the medical wing, where a sick puppy named Luna was receiving treatment. Her small frame trembled under a blanket as a volunteer gently stroked her fur. The inspector frowned. "This area doesn't look up to code. I'll need documentation of your compliance." Mia stepped forward, holding a neatly organized binder. "Here's everything you need. Our facilities meet all state and federal standards." The man took the binder, flipping through it without a word. Charles watched, his nerves fraying with every second of silence. After what felt like an eternity, the inspector snapped the binder shut. "I'll review this further," he said, his tone neutral. "You'll hear from us soon." As he left, the tension in the room was palpable. Charles turned to Mia and the volunteers. "We'll be ready for whatever comes next. We've worked too hard to let this fall apart." Blaze barked once, as if in agreement, and Charles knelt beside him. "You're not worried, are you, boy?" he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Blaze wagged his tail, his confidence infectious. That evening, as the sanctuary quieted down, Charles found himself reflecting on the day's events. The opposition was stronger than he had anticipated, and the threat of legal trouble loomed large. Yet he couldn't ignore the support that was growing around them, the volunteers, the adopters, and even strangers who had started to rally behind their cause. He looked at Blaze, who lay curled up by his feet, and felt a surge of determination. "We're not giving up," he said aloud, as much to himself as to the dog. "We'll fight for this." Blaze lifted his head, his eyes shining with loyalty and trust. Charles knew they were in this together, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity. The protest had made the sanctuary the talk of the town, but not in the way Charles had hoped. News of the zoning complaints spread, fueling both criticism and support. Social media buzzed with debates about the sanctuary's place in the community, and reporters began showing up unannounced, eager for a story. Mia worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating volunteers and managing public relations. She drafted statements, contacted supportive local businesses, and even reached out to the media to counter the negative narrative. "Charles must," she said one morning, waving a tablet in front of him. "You need to see this." He leaned over to look at the screen. It was a heartfelt video posted by Evelyn. She sat in her living room with Daisy curled up at her feet, recounting her story with raw emotion. "When I adopted Daisy, I was at my lowest," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "This sanctuary gave me more than a dog. It gave me hope, and I'm not the only one." The video ended with a plea for support, and within hours it had gone viral. Comments poured in from people across the country, many sharing their own stories of how animals had changed their lives. Charles set the tablet down, his chest tight with emotion. "She didn't have to do that," he murmured. "She wanted to," Mia replied, "and it's working. Donations are pouring in, and we're getting offers from lawyers who want to help with the zoning issue pro bono." Despite the outpouring of support, the challenges were far from over. The Zoning Commission sent another inspector, this time armed with a list of additional complaints from the protesters. The inspector's arrival was met with nervous glances from the volunteers and a low growl from Blaze, who seemed to sense the tension. Charles greeted the inspector with the same calm determination as before, but inside he felt the weight of every complaint. They were picking at details now: parking spaces, noise levels, even the color of the sanctuary's signage. As the inspection dragged on, Blaze stuck close to Charles, his presence a constant reminder of why they were fighting. When the inspector finally left, Charles let out a long breath, but the worry lingered. That evening, a surprise visitor arrived at the sanctuary. A sleek black car pulled up just as the sun was setting, and a well-dressed woman stepped out. She introduced herself as Amanda, a representative from a prominent animal welfare organization. "We've been following your story," she said, shaking Charles's hand. "What you're doing here is remarkable, and we want to help." Amanda explained that her organization had resources and connections that could bolster the sanctuary's operations. They could provide legal assistance, public relations support, and even grants for future expansions. Charles listened carefully, his skepticism tempered by hope. "Why us?" he asked. "There are plenty of other sanctuaries out there." Amanda smiled. "Because you're not just saving animals, you're inspiring people. And stories like yours are what create real change." Over the next few weeks, the sanctuary became a hive of activity. Volunteers worked tirelessly, painting fences, planting flowers, and organizing adoption events. The local community began to shift as more people visited the sanctuary, meeting the animals and hearing their stories. One of the most touching moments came during a small adoption fair. A family arrived with their young son, who was visibly nervous around the animals. Blaze, ever intuitive, approached slowly, his movements gentle. The boy hesitated at first, but soon reached out, his fingers brushing Blaze's fur. "See," Charles said softly to the boy's parents. "Blaze knows when someone needs a little extra patience." By the end of the day, the family had adopted a sweet-natured Labrador named Rosie, and the boy left with a wide smile. But amidst the progress, The tension with the protesters remained. Late one night, Charles received a call from Mia. "You need to get down here," she said, her voice urgent. When he arrived, he found that someone had vandalized the sanctuary's entrance. Spray-painted words defaced the new sign. "This isn't your home." Charles's stomach churned as he surveyed the damage. Blaze stood beside him, his posture tense. Mia placed a hand on his arm. "We'll fix it," she said firmly. "But this has to stop." The next day, Charles held a community meeting, inviting both supporters and critics to discuss their concerns. It was a tense gathering, with heated arguments and moments of frustration. But as the hours passed, something shifted. Evelyn stood up again, sharing her story in person. Other adopters followed, their voices quivering with emotion as they spoke of the sanctuary's impact. Gradually, the crowd's hostility softened. By the end of the meeting, some critics even approached Charles to offer cautious support. One of the last people to leave was the middle-aged man who had led the protest. He lingered near the gate, his expression unreadable. Finally, he approached Charles, holding out a hand. "I was wrong," he said simply. "You're doing good work here." Charles shook his hand, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. "Thank you. That means a lot." As the sun set that evening, Charles sat on the porch with Blaze by his side. The sanctuary was quiet now. The animals settled in for the night. He looked out at the property, the culmination of so much effort and love, and felt a sense of peace. "We're not done yet," he said to Blaze, scratching the dog's ears. "But we're getting there." Blaze wagged his tail, his eyes shining with unwavering loyalty. Together they watched as the first stars appeared, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light would always find a way through. The vandalism incident became a turning point for the sanctuary, sparking deeper involvement from the community. While some rallied around Charles and the animals, others saw it as a chance to double down on their opposition. The zoning commission scheduled a public hearing to determine the sanctuary's future, and the news spread like wildfire. Mia worked around the clock to prepare. "We'll need testimonials," she said, pacing the small office. "Not just from adopters, but from anyone who can speak to the sanctuary's impact." Charles nodded, leaning back in his chair. "We'll have to be ready for anything. They'll bring up every complaint they've ever had, and we'll counter every one of them with facts and heart," Mia replied, her determination unwavering. The day of the hearing arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The town hall was packed with supporters wearing Save the Sanctuary shirts and holding signs, while a smaller group of protesters sat in opposition. Charles felt the weight of every eye on him as he stepped inside, Blaze walking confidently at his side. The hearing began with the zoning commission laying out the complaints: increased traffic, noise disturbances, and alleged environmental concerns. Each point felt like a jab, but Charles remained composed, knowing his turn would come. Mia was the first to speak on behalf of the sanctuary. She presented a meticulously prepared slideshow, showing before and after photos of adopted animals and testimonials from their new families. She highlighted the sanctuary's community outreach programs and its role in educating children about animal welfare. "Ladies and gentlemen," she concluded, "this sanctuary isn't just about animals. It's about people. It's about connection, compassion, and making our town a better place." The room erupted in applause, and Charles felt a surge of pride. Evelyn was next. She stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a piece of paper. "I've lived in this town for over 40 years, she began, "and I've never seen anything like this sanctuary. It's not just a place, it's a lifeline." She shared her story once more, this time adding details about how Daisy had helped her reconnect with her estranged grandchildren. "Because of Daisy, my family is healing," she said, her voice breaking. "How can anyone say this place doesn't belong here?" By the time she finished, even some of the protesters looked moved, but the opposition wasn't finished. The leader of the protest stood, his voice calm but firm. "We're not against animals," he said, "but this sanctuary has grown too big, too fast. It's disrupting the community." He listed complaints about late-night barking and claimed the sanctuary was attracting outsiders who didn't understand the town's way of life. As he spoke, Charles felt Blaze shift beside him, as if sensing the tension in the room. Finally, it was Charles's turn. He stood, his hand steady but his heart pounding. Blaze followed him to the podium, sitting obediently at his feet. "I started this sanctuary with one goal," Charles began, his voice clear: "to give animals a second chance. What I didn't realize was how much it would give people a second chance, too. He glanced at Evelyn and a few other adopters in the crowd. Every bark you hear at night, that's a life that was saved. Every car that drives down this road, that's someone coming to make a difference. Charles took a deep breath, looking directly at the zoning commissioners. I understand the concerns, and I'm willing to make adjustments. But I can't, no, I won't apologize for trying to do something good. The room was silent for a moment before a wave of applause broke out. As the hearing ended, the commissioners announced they would deliberate and deliver their decision in 2 weeks. The waiting period felt like an eternity, and tensions remained high. During that time, Charles doubled down on his efforts to address the concerns. He installed additional soundproofing for the kennels, organized carpool systems to reduce traffic, and even began working on a proposal to create a small park near the sanctuary for the community. Blaze became a symbol of the sanctuary's resilience, often accompanying Charles on visits to local businesses and schools to share their story. His gentle demeanor and heroic rescue of Charles became well known, further solidifying support. The day before the decision, Charles received an unexpected visit. It was the former protest leader, the same man who had stood at the hearing. He looked hesitant, but extended his hand. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, and I realized you're right. This sanctuary has done a lot of good. I still have concerns, but I want to help you make it work." Charles felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, shaking the man's hand firmly. "That means more than you know." That evening, Charles sat on the porch with Blaze, watching the sun set over the sanctuary. The animals were calm, the air filled with the gentle hum of cicadas. He scratched Blaze behind the ears, his voice quiet. "No matter what happens tomorrow, we gave it our all, see," he said. Blaze wagged his tail, his steady presence a comfort. The next day would bring the climax, a decision that could either secure the sanctuary's future or threaten everything Charles had worked for. But as he sat there with Blaze by his side, Charles felt a quiet confidence. They had fought for something worth saving, and that alone was enough to make him proud. The morning of the decision arrived, shrouded in nervous anticipation. Charles barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities. The sanctuary bustled with its usual sounds, dogs barking, volunteers chatting, but an underlying tension filled the air. Blaze sat by Charles's feet as he stood on the porch, staring down the road. Today, the zoning commissioners would visit the sanctuary for a final assessment. The decision wasn't just about zoning permits, it was about the sanctuary's survival. As the first cars pulled into the driveway, Charles's heart pounded. 5 commissioners stepped out, their expressions neutral as they surveyed the property. Mia greeted them with her usual professionalism, clipboard in hand. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We've made some adjustments based on the feedback from the hearing. We hope you'll see the efforts we've put into addressing the concerns." Charles approached, Blaze trotting beside him. "Welcome," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please, let us show you around." The commissioners began their tour, inspecting the newly soundproofed kennels and the improved parking area. Charles spoke candidly about the changes they'd made, while Mia provided statistics on adoptions and community involvement. Blaze became an unexpected highlight of the visit. One commissioner, a middle-aged woman with a stern demeanor, crouched down to pet him. Blaze wagged his tail and licked her hand, eliciting a rare smile. "This is Blaze," Charles explained. "He saved my life in the forest fire that started all of this. He's the heart of this sanctuary." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "He seems like a special dog." "He is," Charles replied, "and he's just one example of the lives we're trying to save here." After the tour, the commissioners gathered in the meeting area where supporters had assembled. Evelyn sat in the front row with Daisy, her eyes filled with hope. Other adopters, volunteers, and even some former protesters were present, all waiting anxiously. The head commissioner stood, clearing his throat. The room fell silent. "We've reviewed the complaints, attended the hearing, and inspected the property," he began. "It's clear that this sanctuary has had a significant impact on both the animals and the community. However, we must also consider the concerns raised." Charles held his breath, Blaze sitting alert at his side. The commissioner continued, "We recognize the efforts made to address these concerns, including noise reduction and traffic management. It's evident that Mr. Charles and his team are committed to being good neighbors." Charles's heart raced as the commissioner paused, looking around the room. "Therefore," he said, his voice steady, "we've decided to approve the sanctuary's zoning permit. The sanctuary will remain operational, provided that regular evaluations confirm compliance with local regulations." A wave of cheers erupted in the room. Charles felt a weight lift off his chest as relief and joy washed over him. Blaze barked, his tail wagging furiously. Evelyn hugged Daisy tightly, tears streaming down her face. Mia turned to Charles, her grin wide. "We did it," she said, her voice barely audible over the celebration. Charles nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We really did." Supporters swarmed around him, offering congratulations and hugs. The former protest leader approached, his expression earnest. "I'm glad you won," he said, extending his hand. "I was wrong to oppose you. Let me know how I can help." Charles shook his hand firmly. "Thank you. That means a lot." As the crowd dispersed, Charles found himself alone with Blaze. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around the dog. "We did it, buddy," he murmured. "We're staying." Blaze licked his face, his warm, steady presence grounding Charles in the moment. That evening, the sanctuary hosted a celebration. Supporters brought food, music played, and the animals seemed to sense the joyous atmosphere. Blaze was the star of the event, moving from group to group, soaking up the affection. Charles stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene with a mix of pride and gratitude. Mia approached, a glass of sparkling cider in her hand. "You should make a toast," she said. Charles hesitated, then nodded. He stepped onto a small platform, raising his glass. The crowd quieted. "I just want to say thank you," he began. "Not just for supporting the sanctuary, but for believing in what we're doing here. This place isn't just about saving animals, it's about saving each other, finding hope, and building a community." He glanced at Blaze, who sat attentively by his side. "And I couldn't have done any of this without Blaze. He saved my life, and he's been my partner through it all. So, this victory is as much his as it is ours." The crowd erupted into cheers, lifting their glasses in unison. Charles smiled, his heart full. As the celebration wound down and the stars filled the night sky, Charles sat on the porch with Blaze. The sanctuary was safe, but more than that, it was thriving. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but every step had been worth it. He looked at Blaze, his voice soft. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Blaze wagged his tail, resting his head on Charles's knee. In that quiet moment, under the vast expanse of stars, Charles knew this was just the beginning. The sanctuary had become more than a place. It was a testament to resilience, love, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. The days following the sanctuary's victory were filled with hope and activity. The news of their success spread, drawing more supporters, volunteers, and adopters. Charles found himself busier than ever, but this time, it was a joyful kind of busy. Every adoption, every wagging tail, every life saved reminded him of why he started this journey. Blaze had become a local celebrity. Visitors to the sanctuary always asked to meet the hero dog, and Blaze seemed to love the attention. But to Charles, Blaze was more than a hero. He was a symbol of the sanctuary's spirit, resilient, loyal, and full of heart. One sunny afternoon, Charles stood by the fence, watching as Blaze played with a group of newly rescued puppies. Their barks and wagging tails filled the air with pure joy. Mia joined him, holding a clipboard but wearing a rare, relaxed smile. "Hard to believe how far we've come," she said, her tone reflective. Charles nodded, his eyes never leaving Blaze. "It's been a journey, that's for sure. But looking at this, at them, it's worth every second," Mia smiled. "You're not just saving animals, you know. You've built something special here, a place where people can heal too." Charles turned to her, his expression warm. "It's not just me, it's all of us. You, Blaze, every volunteer, every supporter, we've all made this happen." Mia gave a small laugh. "And to think it all started with one stray dog and a burning forest." Charles chuckled, his eyes softening. Sometimes the smallest things change everything. That evening, Charles sat on the porch with Blaze, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sanctuary was quiet. The animals settled in for the night. The orange and pink hues of the sunset painted the sky, casting a warm glow over the land. Charles stroked Blaze's fur, his voice soft. "We've been through so much. Haven't we, boy? But look at what we've built together." Blaze rested his head on Charles's lap, his deep brown eyes filled with trust and love. In the distance, the faint sound of laughter carried on the breeze, volunteers sharing stories as they finished their day. The sanctuary wasn't just a place anymore. It was a home, a community, a testament to what could be achieved when people and animals came together. Charles looked down at Blaze, a gentle smile on his face. "This isn't just our victory, buddy. It's the start of something even bigger." Blaze wagged his tail as if agreeing. Charles stood, stretching and looking out at the horizon. He felt a sense of peace, a quiet fulfillment he hadn't known in years. The sanctuary wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a reality, a legacy. As the night deepened, Charles turned to the camera, a warm smile on his face. "Thank you for joining us on this journey," he began. "The story of Blaze and this sanctuary is proof that even in our darkest moments, there's light, love, and the chance to build something beautiful." He gestured towards Blaze, who wagged his tail. "If this story moved you, if it inspired you, I'd like to invite you to become part of our journey. Subscribe to our channel to see more stories like this one, where hope and resilience shine through. And if you're ready for another heartwarming tale, check out this video next. Trust me, it's one you don't want to miss." Blaze barked softly, as if echoing the invitation. Charles laughed. "See, even Blaze agrees. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story."